Thank you for inviting me. It doesn't matter. So, this is a paper joined with two co-authors I had written it before, Adrian and Morten in Stockholm, and Jonathan, who's also there. So the motivation for this is that, as you know, there is a lot of immigration to Europe and across countries. Probably the pressure will increase in the future. And there's worry about the kind of poor educational and labor market performance of some of these groups. Much is known about the first and the second generation. We've seen some evidence of that today, and we will look at the third generation. So I should say first, though, that this paper is not about current immigration waves. There are some relevance to current immigration waves, but the immigration waves are very different to Sweden if you compare those, because if you're going to have third generations, you need to have those who immigrated 2 generations ago, right? So in this case, it would be after the Second World War and the next 3 decades. So whether these have sort of, we learn something for current immigration waves, you know, I'm not sure. I will come back to that a little bit more when you see the composition of the immigrants. Anyway, it's interesting if you want to know about long-term intergenerational convergence in human capital between immigrant groups. So what we mean by that is that you have these different immigrant groups. They are differently educated, and see how long that is lasting across future generations. So we'll study immigrant waves that came here during a time in Sweden when they were still considered quite culturally dispersed. If they were from southern Italy, for instance, or you know, Greece or southern Europe. Back then, that wasn't sort of as you know, close culture as you would say today. But obviously, the composition of immigrations are different than now. And also they were immigrating during a time when there was a huge demand for workers in Sweden. So we escaped the Second World War. There was very fast growth the next couple of decades, and we had a expanding welfare state and low unemployment, free education, and so forth. So the setting should be remembered as well. So just to give a background to the research question, so we just look at 3 generations here. So these are linked. The first generation arrived here, say, 2-3 decades after, I think it was, for these figures, 2 decades after the Second World War. You had, so we are just roughly dividing them into regions here. East Asia you can kind of ignore because there are very few. So that maybe should be merged with some other group here. But you can see that some groups had like 1 year of education, lower than the average Swede. So the 0 here is the Swedish cohort. And some groups had about between 1.5 and 1.5 more years of schooling. So it's quite different, right? Then we see that it kind of stays not that different to the second generation. And it's converging for some regions more than others. And then in the third generations, it's converging even more, but it's still there. So that's kind of what we're interested in. That if there wouldn't be any difference in the third generation, we kind of, we already know that there's nothing there, right? And there's no point of looking at the mechanisms. But we want to know sort of why is it still there, even though those in the second generation spend most of their education in Sweden, the labor market in Sweden, and their kids obviously were born in Sweden. So why are they still kind of this difference? So not only looking at it, they're not converging entirely, because what we know now about intergenerational mobility is that it's much slower than what people were thinking before. So it takes longer time. So if you kind of look at the long-term future generations, there's a lot of evidence now that the mobile is much slower than what previously had been thought. And there's work for a lot of different countries supporting that. So maybe this is just slow family transmission that makes it not converging. But it could also be other factors. And one term that was labeled ethnic capital by George Borjas in a very nice paper from 1992 posted that maybe there are cultural factors, specific factors to the ethnic groups that were sort of acting like slowing down this convergence across generations. And these could be like sort of passive transmissions from culture and norms. It could also be more like that you're relying on network from these groups when your ancestors were from a certain country, or when your family came from another country. And the term ethnic capital is not a great term because we cannot observe ethnicity in this data, as in most other data set. But it's sort of just used a lot. So we kind of, if I'm saying that, I'm not meaning that it's ethnic capital. I mean that's a country of origin capital, which is associated with that. And you know, so it's kind of important if there are just family transmission that is behind that, just like it would be for Swedish descendants, or if there's something else related to what you're coming from, that are still kind of slowing down progress or you know, convergence across future generations. So what we do to look at this is to propose a new approach to do this. So I will come back to that later. But the classical approach is to kind of divide. Look at kind of separating the role of the family from the role of the ethnic capital. And what we were doing here is that we're building on a paper from a couple of years ago where we used that you can link these family dynasties in Sweden. So we linked 4 generations. So that means that if you have an individual, that individual has parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. And if you have great-grandparents, then you can observe cousins in the parental generation. And you can, with registered data as we have in Sweden, you can match the cousins and also who they are married to and their biological relatives, right? So you can sort of build this whole kind of extended family network. And we were using that to show that there's much higher persistence, lower mobility in Sweden than what you get if you just use data on parents and children. Now we will do the same for immigrants, but we only observe 3 generations. So we can observe siblings of the parental generations and their spouses and their siblings and so forth. So why is that important? It's important because you might confuse ethnic capital or ethnic group effects with the extended family, right? So originally, in the original work here, you couldn't separate that, and you know maybe you were it wasn't really culture or norms from the ethnic group. It was actually you're relying on the extended family instead, and that kind of confusing these effects. It could also be that it's simply measurement error, and if you add a variable like ethnic group effects to a regression, you're kind of underestimating the role of the parents by just proxying for things that you can't measure in the family. By having more proper measure of that, using outcomes for the extended family, you can control for that as well. Yeah, and we believe that for immigrants, this might be even more important because just because you kind of replace the networks that might exist for natives already, there might be source of information for having about institutions and so forth, and so potentially this could be even more relevant for immigrants. So relations to other literature, there's a lot of literature. I won't have time to go through this. The most related one is that there is a literature of convergence between immigrant groups for different countries. There is for US, there are a couple of papers for Netherlands, and also an older paper for Sweden, and the findings are a bit mixed of how persistent this is and what the channels are. Okay, so what we find is that, first of all, we do a lot of work on trying to sort of adjust for differences that we don't want to capture with this. So we kind of control for initial neighborhood sorting, for instance, and differences in the age of migration, and that doesn't seem to matter. And if we do the basic specification, we do find that the ethnic group effects does matter. But when we control for extended family, it goes away and becomes very close to zero. So, and if we adjust for measurement error, it also becomes smaller than before, although not as small as when we don't do that. So the argument then would be that there are, still differences in the third generation, but the mechanisms for that are coming from the family or the broader family, not from the ethnic groups for these type of immigrant cohorts. So just to go through quickly the model here. So think about that this is kind of the overall measure of convergence. You have sort of like you have a macro equation, right? But you have it here of ethnic groups, and you're just averaging the variable for each generation, and you run in the regression of this group level, E, ethnic group. And alpha 1 is kind of the group convergence that you can see if it's, somewhere between 0 and 1. If it's 0, you have very, no persistence at all. It doesn't matter what ethnic group your parents belong to. The next generation is just randomly allocated because the ethnic groups just sort of doesn't matter. Whereas if it's 1, it's complete persistence, and it's probably somewhere in between. So what Borjas did then is that he proposed this model where he modeled that the outcome of a child generation is function of the parents' human capital and the ethnic group human capital. And you can regress this model like this. You get gamma 1, gamma 3. You take the sum of these two, and then you're getting alpha 1 because they are nested within each other, right? So you have all parents belong to the same ethnic. If you have one parent from each ethnic group, one parent from each family, that parent necessarily belongs to an ethnic group, so it's kind of nested in it, right? So you can just take the sum of these two, and then you get this overall group convergence. So we will regress that model. Now, there are some issues with this, and even though this is more a descriptive exercise that we try to decompose this descriptive parameter to different sources, there's still a lot of identification threads.
Try not to get too far from the microphone.
Sorry. I will try to look at this instead. The first one is down to control for first neighborhood. We do that because immigrants are not randomly assigned to different regions, and that could, if you have persistent segregation effects, for instance, that could give long-lasting effects for different groups, even though it's not due to the group effects they're coming from, the group where they were assigned initially. And then children to immigrant families enter at different ages. We control for that. Measurement error is a challenge here. If you have measurement error in YP, and you take the average of YP and you include that as a separate regression, you have very little measurement error in the average variable, but you have measurement error bias in the parental variable. That means that the parental variable will be most likely too low, and the other coefficient, gamma 3, will be too high. So reason for why you just find this ethnic group impact is because you have measurement error in the parental variable. So we deal with that in two ways. First of all, we have very good administrative data on the variables that we use, which is years of schooling mainly. And we're also doing another analysis where we add data on income and occupation and use this as a proxy variable for some underlying latent variable, and try to sort of give a more broader measure of the socioeconomic status. So so we hope we deal with this, because that's very important here, and instead we can focus on then what might be missing from this simple model, and that would be the extended family. So that would be the YPD here. We call it D because it's dynasty. So we add that variable, and if they would be nested, you think about that you have a parent who belong to a dynasty or extended family, and all these in the extended family belong to the same ethnic group, then they are nested, right? So then you can just take the average, and the sum of these gamma 1, gamma 2, gamma 3 would be equal to the group convergence effect. Now in practice, people are marrying outside the ethnic group, so this is not holding. We try to correct for that. I will show you very soon how we do that. So think about this. You have some human capital measure for the child, then you have the human capital measure for the parent. We take the average of both parents in most of what we do, and then you have the average for the dynasty, taking away the parents, right? So the rest of the sort of dynasty, not including the parents, and then we take the average of the ethnic groups, net of the extended family and the parents, right? So these are kind of leave-out mean from the other two variables. And because they're not nested, we just use kind of this Gelbach approach, which is kind of a mediation analysis, really. So what you do is that you just kind of multiply by a correction factor, which means that your where you use kind of it's a correction factor where it's based on a regression from the variable for either family or dynasty or the ethnic group. So if it's less than 1, the gamma 1 is overestimated, for instance. You adjust it down. Sorry, the gamma 1 is too low, and then you adjust it. So I will show you it becomes it doesn't really matter for analysis, but we'll do it anyway. So the data, how long do I have?
We have another 20 minutes before you leave 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. So the data we use is Swedish register data. I told you before you can link this family, extended family in Sweden, which is great. We use the child generation. They're all born in Sweden because they are third-generation immigrants. They have at least one parent who is born in Sweden. They have all grandparents are born in non-Nordic countries. So the first generation here are always immigrants born from outside Nordic countries. We take away Nordic countries in the main analysis, by the way. Have at least one parent not born in Sweden. Would make more sense. And have at least one aunt or uncle, because we need to proxy the extended family, but at least one other family member. So that means that the parent who are the child of the immigrant need to have one sibling. So we threw away all the other families if we don't have, if they're not two siblings. Yeah, and I already told you how we can make this by using this great data in Sweden to build family trees. Now, the country of origin here is so if you have two grandparents from different countries, you weight them half, each of them, so we correct for that. And we exclude immigrants from Nordic countries. So this would be the number of, so you see, by the way, this is much smaller than a lot of Swedish data sets because we have all these restrictions and so forth. But these are the absolute numbers in the child generation coming from different countries. And you can see here that these are not the countries that you would look at. Today it would be like Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, for instance, in Sweden. and they are, have very few immigrants from this time. So instead, it's European countries like Germany, Yugoslavia, some former Eastern countries like Estonia, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, and you have to go down to Chile to get some of South America, and then you have some representation from Syria and others. But mostly these are kind of refugee or work immigration, depending on during which time they arrived here. Yeah. So when we run this regression, by the way, we just use it, the observations, and then we also do it, so we weight these equally, and it doesn't matter for the results. So that, but if you would include Nordic countries here, you have Finland completely dominating if you run regression at the individual level. So the variables that we use, we want to have 3 generations for as many families as possible, so therefore we used a grade point average in the last year of compulsory schooling as an outcome. So that's very highly predictive of years of schooling, but we want to do that because otherwise the sample becomes much smaller, and as you will see later, precision is an issue here. We use years of schooling in the parental generation for our main analysis. In Sweden, you typically use educational registers, or if you go further back, you use data from survey data, where they ask about years of schooling. For most of what we're doing here, we're using administrative data, so it's very high quality. You get that in levels, so you have to convert it to years. That's the only issue. The variables are standardized, and we build this ethnic mean variable by using the leave-out mean for individuals born between 1930 and 1970. And neighborhood information, so that's kind of also good. How do we control for that? So we just use register data on the first arriving parish. Okay, so let's just first look at the overall group level relationship, and this is just kind of illustrating that. The dots are in log points, so that's why they all look very similar. You can see it's a very strong positive relationship. It's about 0.6 if you run the regression. And you see there are some outliers here, so there's a lot of smaller countries here that doesn't really matter for the results anyway. So here is the main regression table. So the first regression is just what I showed you. Sorry, I'll walk away again. So the first regression is just that you have an estimate of this alpha 1. So you have this group level grade point average at the country level and years of schooling at the country level. You just run regression, you get 0.63. It's not exactly a correlation, but it's fairly close. And then you do regression where you regress children's grade point average on parents' years of schooling. They are standardized, so this can be interpreted as a correlation. It's about 0.44. Like Kjell said before about years of schooling correlation in some countries, they're actually quite high. In Scandinavian countries, the correlation for earnings and income is very much lower than in the US and some other countries. So this is kind of in line with what you find typically. Then you're adding this ethnic mean variable, and you see it's 0.09 almost. So it's about what is it? Less than 20%, maybe 50, 16, 70% of the overall association. We put two versions of the standard error. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about standard errors, but you can argue that there are different ways of calculating them, and we use cluster standard errors are the big one, the robust heteroscedastic robust standard errors are the low one, the true standard errors are probably somewhere in between. We would argue that this is not as precise as we would like, but it's precise enough to conclude that there is a quite strong effect from ethnic mean in this Borjas regression. In column 4, we, instead of adding ethnic mean, we're adding this measure of extended family. So this is similar to what we did in an earlier paper, but now it's for immigrants instead of natives, and we find again strong effect of the extended family. And then in the 5th model, we are adding both. So column 3 is kind of the Borjas regression, column 4 is what we did before, and then we're adding them together. And what we see then is that ethnic mean goes down to 0. It's, again, a little bit too imprecise for us to be extremely happy about it, but it becomes much smaller. And that would support the story that if you're not accurately measuring impact of network effects from your relatives, you're overestimating the effect of group-based culture from the country of origin. So these are kind of the main results. If you decompose that, it doesn't matter how you decompose it, right? Because the ethnic group effect is very small. You can argue that the parents is somewhere between 64 and 73% in this, so it's still dominating, right? Which is expected, whereas the extended family goes to about up to 1/3 of the effect, or slightly smaller. Additionally, we do a couple of other things here. I'm going to show a nice figure. It might be a bit too small, but it's captured a lot. It's 4 different, rectangular squares here, 5 different ones, and they all capture a different regression model, column 1 to column 5. So in the first one, it's just the regression on the ethnic mean, so that's the alpha 1. In the lowest one, that's a column 5, so we include parents, extended family, and the ethnic mean. And then you have 5 different variations of these models in each of these rectangular boxes. And for instance, we exclude the neighborhood fixed effect when they arrive to see if that matters. Doesn't matter that much. And then we estimate on the group level, so you weight all countries equally. It doesn't matter much either. Then we include the Nordics. It doesn't matter that much. Actually, the ethnic group effect becomes slightly smaller, which is a little bit surprising, but it's not significantly different. And then we include these multiple proxies, and that's kind of for that we're worried about that we're not measuring human capital or correctly, or it's hard what you should call it, but sort of everything that comes from the family. And so we're using income and occupational index in addition to years of schooling. We use an approach where you weight them depending on the impact they have on the next generation, and then you rescale it so the coefficient magnitude is interpreted in the same way. And if we do that, it looks fairly similar, becomes a little bit bigger for the ethnic mean. So it's kind of borderline statistically significant. But it's still much smaller than the total effect. So it's about 10-11% of the overall convergence that could be assigned to the ethnic group effects if you use these 3 proxies for human capital. And that can also be said, so you're estimating a different parameter because you might capture discrimination, network effects on the labor market and so forth. And then we include in the last one, we don't do a proper, we were thinking about focusing the paper a bit more on the role of neighborhoods, but we didn't have such good identification strategy as Kjell showed us before. It is difficult, and so what we do here is that we're just adding this mediating variable, this endogenous variable to regression. You see if something happens to the other coefficients, and it seems like it happens very little. So at least that's kind of supporting that. That doesn't seem to be main channel if you believe the assumptions. That's pretty much, I think I have a couple of more minutes. Then we try to do some between group heterogeneity to look at see what comes from within and between the groups, and look at different these different regions and compare it to Swedish people. So pretty much what we did is that we regressed human capital measure of the child on years of schooling of the parents and years of schooling extended family, dividing these into separate groups, and we see that for non-Swedish it's bigger, the extended family, so that's kind of supporting the original thought we have that the extended family plays a bigger role in this. But then it was a little bit disappointing. We hoped for like a clear-cut pattern where cultural distance is related to, how big this is, and that's not what we find. We find, quite different result that you include the Nordics, for instance, extended family matter a lot. If you look at the rest of Northern Europe, matters little, so there's not really much of a pattern there. So we was a little bit not what we expected, so I probably shouldn't have shown it. So just to conclude, we kind of introduced this new fact. I should say, by the way, that already David Card in an old paper suggested that the Borjas model give bias estimates because you ignore I think he was focusing on other grandparents or other extended family members, and there's a handbook chapter by Dustman and others who also talked about this, but no one sort of properly tested the way we did. So it has been suggested before, but it hasn't really been tested. So we do that, and we find that this kind of we can interpret the sum of these coefficients as separating these different mechanisms, and we find that the role of the contour of regional ethnic capital has been inflated in previous studies, and it doesn't really seem to be a very important remaining factor for that in the third generation. Yeah, that was about it.
Okay, so we've got plenty of time for questions.
Thanks. Super interesting, massive data, of course. I'm just asking about the interpretation of your results. So you say the ethnic capital has been basically overestimated because people have not looked at the extended family. But isn't the extended family a possible mechanism for these ethnic capitals? So isn't it a different kind of, couldn't it be a different way of framing it in that sense?
Yeah, it is difficult to separate them because you can see that you can think about parents being a mediator for ethnic capital, right? Because you measure culture, and then you're kind of the parent. You have culture, and then it's going through the parents, and then it go through the children. So and the same with the extended family. So you could have a that's why we see this more as kind of a descriptive exercise where you kind of try to understand the gap, the ethnic capital gap, and see how much of these can contribute to it. So it is more of a, just like you would do for gender gap, for instance, or some other kind of difference where you want to decompose it into different things. These kind of decompositions are very related to mediation analysis. That's true.
I think what interested me about this is how, given debates on
Yeah.
that we'll be talking about. So do we need to just wait until some of these guys are old enough, or can we say more about that?
So my understanding of UK, and I'm not an expert on it, right? So you correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of these groups where you're talking about these things are actually those who have been there for, is it second generation or something, like from Pakistan or I mean, so it depends like how. So in a way, when I say I don't want to generalize it to it is because so if you take Somalia for instance, so some people describe it as a claim-based society because they don't have national institutions that kind of they have to rely on the clan instead of go outside, and I think we could get a different result if we would do that. Now I don't know that. So you could say that, well, at least the proof is now on their side that they should look at, right? There's no evidence for that. But I think it's just very far to I wouldn't go to politicians in Sweden and say that,
Your largest ethnic group is the Germans, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a slightly different idea.
It is, right?
Very culturally similar.
Exactly.
I think this is super interesting. My question is about interracial, interethnic marriages, particularly for some of those immigrant groups that get small, so it's hard to find another person to marry within their own ethnic groups. So how do you count the extended families and define the ethnic group for those
Yeah.
married groups?
So there is a bit of a problem in a couple of dimensions. One is that you want to have a measure of a lot of groups of the relatives and extended family, right? And so what you can do is you can only if you only take the siblings, then you don't have that problem, right? If you only include them in the regression. The problem then is that you're not observing a very good proxy for the extended family. So then, I don't remember the exact result now, but if you do that, it's going down less, like if you extend more, right? But at the same time, you want to also take into account that it's an endogenous decision whether you choose to marry and who you marry, and that can be something that. So we include that now in the measure. So we were a little bit we probably should do more analysis on that, but we kind of didn't want to. There is a problem of limiting that because just because it is an endogenous choice whether you do that or not. But now we just included them, and yeah, we should do more on that in the paper. I agree with that.
Yeah. I have a question about how you construct these networks, the averages. So you take the average at kind of each level, and that, I guess, that assumes a certain theory of what kind of transmission is taking place and what the mechanism is, right? So my first question is, what mechanism are you trying to get at, right? And I guess the reason I'm asking is that if you think that it's some sense of social capital, you would expect the number of relatives and not just their average outcomes to matter, for example. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So we the only thing we did was we did it by only including the siblings, and then you have one for everyone, right? So then you go away that. But what you're saying is that it is important that you want to include them, and we don't do that here because we take the average. So in that way, you could think about that you're using a more elaborate measure. You can take the numbers, you can take the max of in a group or something like that. We did a lot more of that in the other paper, and it didn't seem to matter very much. But I presented this very recently, and I got similar, not the number one, but a similar one that you should use different dimensions on it, so I think we could. In a sense that if you're interested in the role of the extended family and the magnitude of that, this is very important. Now, if you're interested in whether the ethnic capital contribution goes down to 0, it won't matter. Most likely, right? Because if you expand more elaborate measures of it, you probably would expect it to not, increase again, right? So say you have a very, very flexible model, right? So if you're interested specifically in that, I completely agree with you. Yeah, but that's why we haven't dig too much into it.
Okay, so you're saying that you're already explaining away the quote-unquote ethnic effects,
Yeah.
you're doing good enough job.
Yeah.
If we don't have any more questions, we can all be silent for a minute. We can give the permanents an extra time.
Thank you.